Penny Bunker, Governance Manager.
Councillor Liz Mays, Lead Member for Health and Adult Social Care.
Martin Bolt, Councillor for Murfield.
Tom Gay, Flood Manager.
And welcome all to our meeting. First item is minutes of the previous meeting. Oh, and I should have said before, we have got apologies from 3 of our standing members due to different work commitments, families and illness. So, okay. Item 1, minutes of the previous meeting. We are quorate. Councillor Sage and myself make the meeting quorate. So you're happy to accept the minutes? Yes, I am as well. Interest, do you have any interest to declare? No. This is a meeting in public, and Councillor Paul's here as an observer. Is there any particular interest that you need to declare, Martin?
No pecuniary interest, but obviously I'm interested particularly in the report on the flood strategy and how it affects the areas of Kirklees surrounding Murfield.
Fair enough. Admission to the public. All of this agenda is in public, and everybody's welcome to join in and take part. And then item 4, our main item today, is the local flood risk management strategy. This is a regular item at Overview and Scrutiny, and I'd like to thank Tom Gee for all his support to Scrutiny over the years, and for providing us with such a great detailed report. There's a lot in this, and it looks pretty good to me. So is there anything you'd like to highlight out of the report?
I'll just give you a brief intro as to why it's here again. The Flood and Water Management Act requires the Council to produce, implement and monitor a local strategy. The Council agreed some time ago, or Cabinet agreed some time ago, that the scrutiny process would be the best place to monitor progress against the action plan. A 5-year refresh of the strategy is just being completed, concentrating the action plan on a smaller number of actions. I think we originally had around about 32 actions in the 2012 plan. Most of those actions have now been completed and are embedded in the day-to-day working of the team. So we've reduced the number of actions down to 11. And there's a revised template for the annual report to scrutiny that reflects that. It's a little bit easier, I hope, to understand the work we're doing and the priorities we have for the coming period. The schemes to protect properties from main river flooding are becoming very difficult to justify. We tried a couple of locations in Kirklees to try and justify river defence schemes, Murfield being one location, which Councillor Bolt is obviously aware of. The focus in the new strategy, in the new action plan, is really to try and develop plans to manage surface water risk, which are smaller in scale generally and more affordable. We're looking to continue to support the planning department as a technical consultancy on new development sites. We'd like to continue with our programme of member and community engagement work, and really we need to try and get the best out of the Council's budgets for maintenance and improvements of the highway drainage and culvert systems across the district. And lastly, we'd like to encourage any initiative that looks at natural flood management improvement in the upper catchments. Hopefully the new annual progress and implementation plan that's included in Appendix B, I think it is, will give scrutiny a much better flavour of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve for the coming years. It is a bit lengthy this year because I've tried to include a summary of the works that we've done in the previous 5 years, but next year's plan will just be a statement really on what we've done on the previous 12 months.
Okay, Councillor Smith, did you have any questions?
Thank you. Looking at your progress against the actions, which is page 39 of the papers, you have done some assessment work at Bursell, Hetman, Wyke and Dalton. Have you shared that assessment work with ward councillors?
It hasn't been shared. We've obviously done, well, you can see the number of plans that we've done over the last 5 years. There's a large number. Most of them recommend works that are probably unaffordable in terms of what the scope of the work is. delivering the large-scale works depends on successful funded applications to the Environment Agency, who have very kind of rigid guidelines as to what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. There are things I could share with members in relation to smaller recommendations within those plans, but it isn't something we've done previously. It depends on the level of consultation that you expect from those outputs.
Which brings me to my next question, and you've got quite a few items on that page about community engagement and consultation. And I'm just wondering where you've done that community engagement and how it's worked.
Yeah, there were a couple of pilot projects that were done in Ewson Ward and Home Valley South to try and test whether it was valuable to members and whether the format we were proposing to do it in was a suitable format. We got an awful lot of information to share, and we could share too much to the extent that it would be quite difficult to understand and quite difficult to read, or we can share too little in that it's not useful to members. So we've been through a process on those two pilot projects to try and gauge the right level of information. They've been completed, and we have a format now and a style which we're looking to extend to the other wards in the district. As well as the ward member engagement in the informational leaflet, we will engage then with the communities within those wards, the higher risk communities, to pass on as much information as we have in relation to the local risk that they have. So the intention is to make them much more aware of the risk around their particular property. So it may be a trash grill that's at the bottom of the street that they may be unaware of. We're just asking them to pay more attention to that. Not to clear the grill themselves, but there are eyes and ears on the street as issues develop. So it's a 3-year plan to try and get right across the district to all the high-risk communities. It's a 3-year plan to try and get out to all the ward members who will be interested in the information we have. So it's progressively being extended to the other wards.
It's just that I remember the pilot areas being discussed last year when you came, and so I was wondering how you'd move forward from those, because I hadn't seen anything else outside of those areas, and quite clearly it's an important area that people would want information on. Which leads me to ask about the capacity in the team then for delivering this. I notice you've got some extra, a graduate engineer and an external technical consultant providing advice. So how are you planning on moving forward with the other areas, consulting in the other areas of high risk, and have you got the capacity in the team to do that?
I think the fact that we planned it over 3 years reflects the fact that I've got limited resources. We think over 3 years, that's a reasonable period to pass the information across. And we've got a programme now that means we can deliver it with the existing members of the team. It's principally the graduate engineer who's been given that ownership of that particular task. As I said earlier, we've got a foundation degree student in for 20 weeks this summer and 20 weeks next summer. The intention is for them to assist in that process as well. So I'm confident we can deliver it within 3 years. I think what I would say is that if you look at the list of the numbers of properties that are at risk in the various wards, you probably find there's a similar number of homes at risk in probably all the wards, whether it's from main river risk or surface water risk. So for me to prioritise which wards we consult with first is a little bit difficult because they're all at a similar level of risk. So any interest I get from ward members to say I'd like our ward to be done next, I'd kind of listen to that because I'd rather work with ward members who are proactive and constructive, and I can certainly consider Councillor Smage's ward as maybe one of the next priority.
I just want to pick up on that bit about communities as well, because I know it's always been the biggest challenge for the past few years, how to engage people without scaring them about the risk of flooding. And you do make a reference on page 29 about tools that encourage self-help, and I just wondered how that was developing. What sort of tools?
I mean, the best tool is actually getting people who are interested. If you get a resident who wants to talk to you, you can share all the information that you have within the team. So when you get a connection with community representatives, it's far easier to have that conversation about what information we have and all the advice that's available in relation to what they can do to protect their property. There are some fairly invasive things they can do to protect their property, fairly kind of works that require construction, such as floodboards, door guards, that kind of thing, air brick covers. But generally speaking, we wouldn't recommend that unless there was we had a high degree of confidence that they were at risk from flooding on a regular basis. And to be honest, there aren't that many properties around the district who suffer repeated flooding to that extent. So the kind of tools we normally use are reference to some of the national recommendations that are available from the Environment Agency in particular. They've got some good advice sheets on what they can do in relation to maintaining water courses that may run in their back gardens or at the bottom of their back garden. There's information about what they can do to relocate vulnerable furniture and belongings that they may have on the ground floor, for example. There's recommendations available from the Environment Agency on how to manage the internal kind of accommodation, the ground floor accommodation in your property. I think the important thing is we try and get a conversation going, and we, as part of the community engagement, we try and encourage people to contact us if they have any information that they can share with us. That allows us then to share the information that we've got.
Yeah. Also on that page you've got about EA-funded culvert improvement project. You're into year 3 of 5. But you've also got a bid for EA funding to address surface water flood risk. So how is that bid going?
Well, that bid hasn't gone in yet. That's part of the work programme for this year. We're moving away from looking at the impact from main river risk. I think that's becoming problematical in relation to the amount of partnership funding, third-party funding that is required to deliver those schemes. The surface water risk gives us a much better opportunity of introducing smaller scale works that we can contribute to. And we've got to try and find a way of working with our external consultants to try and find a way of going across the whole district in relation to identifying where surface water risk is highest. So it's not a bid we put together yet. We're trying to work out the best way to frame that bid. It'll probably end up with things like watercourse improvements, the minor watercourses we have, the small streams. There is capacity we can create within those streams by raising flood banks, by providing storage areas adjacent to those watercourses. So if they do surcharge, they don't spill out of the watercourse. They fill land that is safe to flood. So it's not a bid that we've actually made yet, but it's an aspiration for this year.
Because surface water flooding can also occur where there's no watercourses, can't it? So I'm wondering if you were going to ask ward councillors where they are aware that there is regular flooding, surface water flooding in their areas, because sometimes it's not where you naturally would think it is. I know we have several areas that in heavy rain just simply flood. And even if the drains have been cleared recently, it still floods. So it's about other engineering other engineering requirements, I think. So perhaps you could ask ward councillors where their areas of surface water flooding is most highest, I think.
We have tried that before. We had a small project in New Mill a number of years ago to try and get as much information as we could from the local community there. It isn't just ward members. Obviously there are people, particularly farmers. Farmers are a particularly good resource of where their water goes. But it's incredibly difficult to extract the information that they have in their memories, their distant memories, onto paper. That's the problem, actually documenting what they know in a format that we can actually work with. We tried a New Mill and it was disappointing, the results we had back. We had a little back from the community, or from ward members for that matter, about issues that they had. There's no reason why we can't replicate that exercise in other wards, and it's probably, I think you're absolutely right that the information that we get from our computer models is not really a perfect world. There's a lot of imperfections in the way that the drainage systems work across the district, and there will be pockets of flooding that will not be predicted by the computer programs. So it needs to be a combination of both, really, both the predicted flood maps and that local knowledge.
I only had one other thing to ask you about. And on page 40, you talk about highest risk private flood defence and drainage assets. And that looks like it's going to be a tough call to be able to pull that off. And I know you've made no progress yet, but is there plans to do anything or any engagement with that?
I think that's likely to be opportunistic. I think to do that in a planned way by looking at every single private flood defence. And by those, I mean things like maybe a garden wall at the bottom of a property, at the bottom of a garden that forms the bank of a small watercourse. In effect, that is an informal flood defence that's privately owned and privately maintained. But to actually survey all that, you'd have to survey every single length of watercourse and laboriously record where every wall or feature could be an informal flood bank, forms some kind of flood defence sort of facility. I think that's impractical. So the approach we normally take is if we investigate the flood incident and find that there is a private defence that has some benefit, we'll engage then with the landowner and work with them to actually get some recommendations to them as to how they can maintain it. There is a process you can go through to actually what they call designate that as a formal flood defence, and that puts legal restrictions in on what that landowner can do with that flood defence. So it restricts them in relation to they can't remove it without permission, and they can't amend it without permission. But there's very, very few authorities around the country that have used those powers yet because they put a burden then on the council to monitor and to maintain that relationship with that landowner. So I think we'll do it opportunistically. If we need to engage with the private landowner, we will when it becomes an issue that we become aware of.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I was wondering if it was a realistic target to have for you, as considering the limited capacity you have. But I suppose if you're doing it on this opportunist basis, then fair enough. Okay, so Councillor Bolt, did you want to ask anything?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I'd like to thank Tom and his team for the work that's been going on over several years in this. I know you've attended a number of public meetings. A couple of procedural things first. Could you outline, Tom, what measures have been taken in the Home and Colne Valley, funded by the Combined Authority, to reduce flood risk, particularly further downstream?
Yeah, there was a recent grant-funded scheme that's been started in the last 2 to 3 months. The National Trust are the managers of that scheme. It was a bid that was put together by a council officer who was successful. I can't remember the exact value of it, but it was certainly something like 1.5 million, I think, in total. And that involves a host of different interventions into the land at the National Trust own. So it's Marsden Moor Estate, essentially, above Marsden. And they're looking at all kinds of things to try and retain water in that moorland area. So it can involve things like blocking natural drainage grips by putting natural barriers across the valleys, the small valleys. It might involve peatland restoration as well, to try and make sure the peat stores more water than it currently does. The whole idea is you try and retain that water at source, so it stays in the ground longer. It doesn't get into the River Colne, and then down into the River Calder, and onwards into York and the Humber. So it's a very, very long-term plan to gradually reduce the amount of water that runs off the upland areas. But it's certainly got some traction now nationally in relation to government thinks it's something worth doing. If you can find support of landowners. I think we're lucky above Marsden that we have the National Trust there on Yorkshire Water, who own most of the land. They're relatively easy to work with, and they're constructive. They want to try and manage the land in a way that has community benefit. So that's one particular scheme we're looking at. We're also looking at widening the kind of works that we've done there. We've got some good, we should have a good evidence base there to say investment there does make a difference. And the intention is to try and extend that to other funding bids in the rest of the catchment. So we're looking principally at the Colne and the Home. But in theory, there's no reason why that shouldn't apply to the Upper Dearne, for example, or maybe even the Spen. We've got some fairly significant tributaries to the Calder elsewhere within the council. So As I say, it was a priority in the revised strategy to look at natural flood management, and it's all part of the kind of the wider picture in relation to try and retain more water in those upper areas to try and reduce the amount of water that ends up in the valley bottom.
Yeah, thanks for that, because as you say there, natural flood management, the Calder, Upper Calder's working a lot on that. There's a group called Slow the Flow up Marden Road, Heaven Road. The cone there you're talking about, so I think it is imperative that we get landowners feeding into the home valley engaged in that, because the Boxing Day 2015 floods were as a result in Murfield of the confluence of the home, Cone and Calder all congregated at Cooper Bridge and then spilling and flooding homes and particular businesses in Murfield. There were millions of pounds of businesses affected. So I think natural flood management, the home is the area that we appear now to be needing to concentrate. For residents, yeah, we just approved the local plan in Kirklees. Were there any major flood measures put in the local plan? Because, Chair, you can't take mitigating measures unless you provide some compensation elsewhere. And as Tom knows, one of the issues that's been looked at is the possibility of easing the flow of the River Calder downstream from Murfield so that those homes and businesses don't flood. But there is nowhere immediately in Murfield where we can mitigate by providing, like they have on the Ouse and others, where they have overspill. So was there anything in the local plan to provide that, either using former quarrying sites in Dewsbury and Ravensthorpe, former sewage beds which are often adjacent to the river? You know, did the local plan give any salvation, if you like, to those homes and businesses in Kirklees affected?
I'm not aware there was anything specifically allocated for that purpose. The principle of any flood management scheme is that you shouldn't increase the risk downstream. That's a principle. So if you allow the water to flow more quickly through a community to protect that community, I think as Martin intimated, there should be some mitigation measures there to accommodate that volume of water elsewhere in a safe way. So any scheme that the Environment Agency promotes in the Upper Valley shouldn't make the situation any worse for somebody downstream. That's a principle of the fund and approval. So in relation to allocating land within the local plan for those purposes, I'm not aware that any was allocated. The involvement of my team in the local plan was to make sure that any development sites identified were not free of flood risk but could manage flood risk effectively or safely. So we've had some input into the allocations within the local plan to make sure that the sites that are promoted can be developed safely from a flood risk point of view. But I'm not aware of any plots of land that were allocated for flood storage or that kind of purpose.
Can I recommend then that maybe your next two wards to develop local projects on might be Murfield, Liz and Martin, if you've got willing members here, and maybe the elected members in Murfield might want to work with Tom and his team to look at local solutions. Is that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Just picking up on that, what I was going to lead on to is following the local plan, and you're aware of this, Chair, as well in your ward, is Murfield is developing a neighbourhood plan. Perhaps we can work with Tom's team, as he said, to use that as a feed-in, because the neighbourhood plan, if we can provide policies, will give it some stability. I was then going to ask, is there any potential, we've talked about resources, of including a supplementary planning document in planning to get some funding and resilience for the team to develop bigger schemes, because as you say, with the human or financial resources, we are limited. But it would seem sensible to get some input from developers to help us protect the communities from flooding.
I'm obviously, I'm not a planner, so I'm a little unclear of the rules, but my understanding is that if and when SIL comes in, the Community Infrastructure Levy, flood risk is one of the factors within there that can be legitimately be allocated funding from developers on a collective basis. So I think it is in there. It obviously takes its priority in relation to a list of other priorities. But I think there is a mechanism through SIL where we can maybe invest in flood defence schemes that have got a wider benefit than maybe just a single development site.
Yes, please.
On page 41, you've got a list of initiatives carried out in the last 5 years, and a lot of these have against them local levy. So what funding did you use in relation to this local levy?
Can I just clarify just how the funding works? There's a national pot of funding called National Grant and Aid, Flood Grant and Aid, and any scheme that is developed locally has to take has to justify itself against every other scheme that's developed across the country. And there's a very, very complicated funding calculator that the Environment Agency used to give a particular project a score. That is then assessed against other schemes elsewhere in the country. It is quite difficult to secure funding through that. But there is a local levy that the council contributes to. It pays a levy every year towards a Yorkshire and Humber pot. I think at the minute, Kirklees pays around about £190,000 a year. Leeds and other larger authorities will pay proportionately more. That gives about £2 to £2.5 million a year to be used across projects in Yorkshire and Humber. And as you can see on the list there, we've been quite successful in securing funding for those kind of things that wouldn't normally attract national grant and aid. So it's things like studies, it's things like support officers. If you need a particular officer from the Environment Agency to support a general kind of piece of work, that could be funded. It's been useful in relation to some of the small initiatives that we've had, and there's been a little bit of council match funding that we've offered from time to time. But generally speaking, we've probably secured something like an average of £250,000 to £300,000 a year, I would guess, over the last 5 years. So we've kind of got back a little bit more than we paid in. But it has given us some additional resource, because obviously then we employ consultants to carry out these studies. So it has worked quite well for us, and the idea is we continue to explore that pot of money, because it's a little bit easier to get that money than it is grant and aid.
My last question is at page 40. You've got that you've updated the operational flood plan, and you've put in the plan has been in place for 18 months but is yet to be tested in river conditions. Thank goodness. But the plan to be tested in a practice event, and I was wondering how you were going to do a practice event for flood risk.
That's been overtaken by events. A few weeks ago we had some heavy rain, and that plan is now being tested. And there's some pretty serious learning points to be learned from that. It didn't work as well as we expected. So there are some. I've got a meeting with emergency planning this week to discuss some changes to the policy to make sure that we can deliver the things that we put in there originally. So we don't need a practice event anymore. We actually had a test event when we had that heavy rain. So about 3 weeks ago, I think, 3 to 4 weeks ago. But the idea is it is a living document. We will, as and when we get issues with it, we will tweak it and try and make sure that it works in a much more effective way.
You just reminded me on that, Tom, as part of the plan to alert local communities to things like road closures, because I believe you've been contacted by a Murfield resident who alleged that you'd promised that, because obviously we have roads adjacent to the River Calder, which, when you do get that event, it did flood. What's the situation for alerting residents? Should that be through yourselves, or is that by signing up to the Environment Agency flood warnings?
It can be done either way, really. The difficulty, the way it's meant to work is we have a number of what we call spotter locations, I suppose, key locations around the district where we think if we get a flood event, those are the locations where it will flood first. And the idea is we get the intelligence from the Environment Agency through their flood warnings, and from the Met Office in relation to the weather warnings, and then between the flood management team and emergency planning, we try and anticipate the event that might occur. And if we feel it's going to trigger flooding, we will try and mobilise those spotters, those people that we have allocated to those locations, to be the eyes and ears on the ground. And the feedback we get from them in relation to rising river levels or flooding to roads should get fed back then to the operational control within highways. So Stenard Lane, for example, is usually the road that will flood first. We should have a spotter there before the event happens. And as and when that river level rises, that information should go back to highways. We should make a decision then to close the road based on the intelligence from the person on the ground. I think in reality what happened on that day was that the information we got from mainly the Environment Agency was inaccurate. So we couldn't mobilise a spotter there in time to get somebody there to give us the information from the site. But having said that, there's absolutely no reason why somebody shouldn't report it then to either the police or to the Environment Agency, and then it's down to those organisations to make a decision as to what they do then. But the way the plan should work is we should have people on the ground before it happens. The information gets fed back and we take action then. That's the way it's meant to work. It failed on that day for the reasons I've outlined.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Very informative as ever, and I think your team's doing a cracking job with the resources it's got. So thank you very much for your contributions. And it's great to have members that are passionate to work alongside officers to address these local issues. So thank you for your contributions. Then we were going to move on to agenda item 5. So, but if you feel free, if you want to make tracks, get back. All right, take care. And for me and Liz, we've really just got these lead member reports are just for noting. I think we agreed. Unless there's anything missing from yours that you want to add to it.
I just want to highlight a couple of things. Ambulatory emergency care at Dewsbury. There's been an agreement to establish a joint scrutiny working party with the Wakefield Council, so that's in the work plan for the coming year now, and we've got a date that's highlighted for that. And also the Calderdale and Huddersfield NHS Foundation Trust, the Kirklees and Calderdale joint health scrutiny, will be looking at more business cases from them, and that should be coming up soon as well. But also vascular services, the acute vascular services, there's discussions at a West Yorkshire level on this because there's some proposed changes to acute vascular services. And last week, the Kirklees scrutiny panel agreed that it was a significant change for ourselves. Some of the West Yorkshire councils will be looking at it the same, and then there will be a JOSC put in place. Okay, but I did want to record my thanks to all the committee members and to the officer Richard for all the support during the year. Thank you.
Thank you. And on my report, I just omitted the LMT Leadership Management Team. I went to the Leadership Management Team meeting to talk about the recommendations from Scrutiny, and they were all very positively received, and we're just waiting on formal action plan to identify timescales and lead officers for each of those recommendations, but they've all been very enthusiastically received by leading officers and leading members. And also I did personally write to each of our voluntary co-optees, thanking them for their contributions for the year, well, for several years in many cases, for what they've provided for Kirklees Overview and Scrutiny, and I think because they are doing a great job and really important. So yeah, that was all. And the only other item on the agenda was the first meeting of the new municipal year. It's penciled in for the 10th of June. I'm sure that will depend very much on the elections and who's appointed to which position in the new municipal year. I have had a meeting with the Chief Exec and talked about the importance of succession planning and making sure we've got enough members with the right skills and understanding to take forward the leading positions. So I'm hoping there'll be a new process in place to make sure we get the right people leading the different key roles in the future.
Can I just acknowledge the contribution that you've made to Scrutiny over the years, and to thank you for your work as Chair of Overview and Scrutiny. We were unable to do it at the Council meeting because we ran out of time, but I wanted to make sure that it was said in this meeting. Thank you.